Saints of the Americas is a series that seeks to share information on the life and times of the saints of the Catholic Church celebrated in the Americas. Your program hosts are Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.
Welcome to our show. We're going to talk about Father Walter Cisek. It's interesting because this priest who was born in 1904 in the Shenandoah Valley in Pennsylvania really did not spend all his life in the United States, but spent many years as a missionary overseas in the Soviet Union, which is very unusual. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but let's talk about his beginnings. He was probably an unlikely candidate for the priesthood, but this was something that he always wanted to do.
Oh, absolutely. Though something he always wanted to do, but it came as a great surprise to his father when he told him. Prior to that, his parents had immigrated from Poland. But he, as you said, he was born here in Pennsylvania. By his own autobiography, he describes himself at times as a bully, as a street fighter, as a leader of a gang. We know so much so that this was part of his early life and his activities that were really kind of leading him in destructive ways. We know that his own father asked the police if they could just send him away to some reform school or to something like that. And so when that was discussed, that's the first time he tells his father, well, I want to be a priest. You know, I'm sure that at first the father probably thought this is just an excuse to get out of reform school, but he was very serious about this. And so we see this change in his life from this self-described street fighter and gang leader, candidate for reform school, ends up a candidate for the seminary.
You know, it's interesting as you were talking, I didn't want to read anything into his early life, but you wonder if those traits that he had that were unseemly really helped him in the Soviet Union, because he had to have some strength and some determination and some tremendous leadership in order to do what he did as a Jesuit missionary in the Soviet Union. So if he was a nice guy or very humble and quiet, those qualities may not have served him well in his missionary work in the Soviet Union.
No, so absolutely. I would think having some street smarts would have served him a little better than being just a pure academic.
Exactly. Let's talk about his early training and then his subsequent going as really a clandestine missionary in the Soviet Union, because this was a time when Christianity and the church was highly unwelcome in this very pagan country.
Well, we know that his first experience as seminary was in Orchard Lake in Michigan, predominantly a seminary that we know nowadays of training people of Polish ancestry and Polish background. We know that there he really got involved in a regiment to kind of deal with difficult conditions. He used to love to swim in the cold water, and he used to love to run 5 miles a day. So he really was preparing himself to be physically fit as well as spiritually and intellectually. We know that he has studies then in Rome, that he goes to Rome. One of the things that captivates him then for this whole journey to the Soviet Union was around this time when he's in Rome, Pope Pius XI is looking for volunteers to go and serve as missionaries to the newer Soviet Union, the former Russia. And we know that is what piques Walter's curiosity. At that point then he can't get enough information. He wants to read everything and learn everything and know everything about this newer Soviet Union.
And we also see that he really gets thrust into the Soviet Union. He gets really accosted, he gets questioned by the KGB. We know that what he is doing as a missionary is being seen by those people who are in government who do not want this to continue. And yet we see him continuing his work as a Jesuit missionary, administering the sacraments, preaching the word, celebrating that faith even clandestinely, because that was what they had to do. But his perspicacity, his sense of doing this because he has to do it. And that really was his call, as you had mentioned from the beginning. This was something that he wanted to do. And how many of his classmates or confreres would have been called to go to serve in the Soviet Union? Granted, he would have come from a Polish background. They would have understood that whole sense of persecution, of being not allowed to openly at times practice their faith, and how important it was for him to allow people to do that.
Exactly. And we know that he is so committed to the faith. It's that duality of being so captivated with this country that invites this persecution, but yet he felt the call to change the ways, to minister to and to reach out to people. We know that ultimately, though, it does bring about personal persecution for him. He is considered to be a spy for the Vatican. The stories even go that given a drug-laced tea, he confesses to being a Vatican spy. They then want him to spy for the Soviet Union. He refuses, and he's given a 15-year jail sentence of hard labor.
And it's interesting how, as he is in this prison setting, in this slave labor camp, that he continues to work by celebrating Mass, by doing some of the things that he is called to do as a priest and also as a missionary. And meanwhile, in the United States, his community really officially declared him as deceased because they hadn't heard from him. They didn't know where he was, what he was doing, because he was sent to this prison. And so it's several months later, towards the end of his sentence in Siberia, that he understands and that they understand that he's still alive.
Yes. And the interesting thing is that he's released just a few months shy of his full sentence, but then he still is under the control of the Soviet Union. They don't permit him to leave. He has to stay in Siberia. A few years later, I think he's released in 55. He's still there in 63. The KGB summon him, and they, whether he's even aware of what's happening, they've been holding on to him because they figure he's of value. And so in 1963, there's an exchange where the Soviet Union, the United States returns a couple from the Soviet Union accused of spying, and Father Cisek returns back to the United States, being gone for nearly 30 years at that point from when he went to Rome. We know that he ends up at Fordham University as a professor and someone who gives retreats and finishes out his life there.
Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment. The Society of St. Paul announces a new book on Padre Pio by Italian journalist Stefano Campanella. The director of Padre Pio Television gives readers an intimate insight into this saint who Pope Francis appointed as one of the great patrons of the Jubilee Year of Mercy. This edition can be found at St. Paul's Books and Gifts at 926 Boardman Poland Road, located across from the Olive Garden restaurant. This book on Padre Pio talks about his time in the sacrament of confession with countless of Catholic pilgrims, and as a contemplative saint whose life was blessed in countless ways. Visit St. Paul's Books and Gifts Monday through Saturday from 11 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. or call 330-953-2443 or email at stpaulsbookstore@gmail.com to learn more about Padre Pio and many other great saints of the Catholic Church.
I am Marino.
Yo soy Marino.
Marino, an American Catholic organization of priests and brothers, has been reaching out to those in need for nearly 100 years in 26 countries throughout the world. Missioners, workers, volunteers, supporters, we are all Marino.
I'm Father Mike, and I am Marino.
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 Welcome back to our show. Now we're going to talk about Catherine de Hueck Doherty. Like the last saint we talked about, Walter Cisek, whose life could have been a novel, her life probably could have been a novel as well. We find this woman who is called Baroness because of her marrying a royal, make lots of changes and lots of interesting twists and turns throughout her life, but also being lifted up as a servant of God. So let's start with her early beginnings.
As you said, it's almost like a novel. She's born in Russia. Her parents are aristocrats. Now, it's worth noting her father was a Russian Orthodox and her mother was Lutheran. Because of her father's work, being an aristocrat and probably a attaché or some type of diplomat, they traveled rather extensively during her young formative years. We know that she's been in Alexandria, she was in Istanbul. We know that that's when she first has her exposure to the Catholic faith. She's taught by Catholic nuns while there. We know that she speaks 6 languages and understands 3 others because of their great travel. But then that travel also would have exposed her to the poorest of the poor. Right. We know that in traveling these places, we have images during that time, there would have been in every train station beggars, just looking for a crust of bread. So although she's born into this opulence and this wealth, she's also exposed at an early age to deep poverty. And her parents, to their benefit and to their credit, they teach her about the poor, and they teach her about that responsibility to the poor. So that's her early years. But we know even at the age of 15 then, her life takes a turn when, as you said, she marries a baron, and she ends up with the title Baroness. We know that this is just prior to the beginning of World War I.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because then finally, because of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, her and her husband then made their way to England in 1920, and that's when she was received into the Catholic faith. Mm-hmm. So this conversion process began, as you had mentioned, with listening and being taught by the nuns in Alexandria, Egypt, to her time then in England when she was received into the faith. And so while they were celebrating that and their life together in Canada, then eventually they immigrated to Canada. And so we see them going to another country, which brings them to the Americas. And so this whole sense that they are people on the move because of their particular situation, they also have the wherewithal to be able to do that. Mm-hmm. And we see them now in Toronto. And what is she doing in Toronto now with those that she comes to minister to?
Well, first, the title at this point, Baroness, is a little misleading if we think of wealth because of what happened with the loss of wealth and property with the revolution, and then the moving from Finland to England. They really don't have anything but a title at this point. Stories are full of penniless, titled aristocrats trying to marry into wealth. Well, she's married to someone already and there's no money. She works as a laundress, as a waitress. Because of her knowledge of languages, she becomes a lecturer and a translator. We know that there's a child born at this time. However, that journey of faith that becomes part of her life doesn't necessarily become part of Boris's life. And we know that he starts to live a rather dissolute life, debauchery, drunkenness, and as a result, they separate by 1930.
And then we know that in 1940, she hears about this particular place called Friendship House, which is located in Harlem. And they're doing the work that she likes to do. She comes in contact with someone who eventually becomes her second husband. Mm-hmm. And let's talk about some of those circumstances. We say, well, how can someone who is Catholic get married again?
Mm-hmm. Well, we know that though they separated in 1930, they really don't divorce for quite some time. Mm-hmm. And again, we don't know the circumstances. We could speculate. I don't have all the information. But oftentimes what would happen is they would just go their separate ways and forget about the whole need for a legalized divorce. We know that they then were divorced and that she was granted an annulment by the Catholic Church. She marries, his name is Eddie Doherty, and he had been married twice before, but in both circumstances widowed. And so we know that he was free to marry, we would say, because there was no prior bond, if we want to get legally, with both of his spouses being deceased. He's not attached to anyone physically in this world. The annulment process for Catherine says that there was something lacking in the sacramental character of their union. Certainly her being age 15, perhaps her family married her off to this aristocrat, force, fear, fraud, those are some things that come into it. Whatever the circumstances were, the church recognized that he was widowed, she was annulled, and these two could come together in a marriage sanctioned by the church.
And we know subsequently when they were married in 1943 that they did work together in this place called Friendship House in Harlem. But then obviously some things were not quite copacetic with them and the ministry that they were providing there. And so eventually they find a new apostolate, but it's not in New York. They find themselves in Canada. So let's talk about that subsequent travel to another country.
They end up moving to Canada now. She had been in Canada before she found her way to Friendship House and to Harlem. But they move on and they found a new rural apostolate that they called Madonna House. And that was a community for both laity and priests committed to living the gospel values of charity, of dignity and reverence and respect for all. Now the members took vows of chastity and poverty and obedience, but except for the priests, the laymen and women were able to marry and able to live out lives much like Eddie and Catherine. We know, though, that this ministry invites them to write articles and books. Interesting turn for Eddie's life, though. We discover that he then goes to the Holy Land and studies for the priesthood in the Melkite Greek Catholic Church. And once ordained, he does return to Madonna House, and he dies in 1975. So again, another more contemporary story.
And we know that Catherine, who wrote hundreds of articles and more than 30 books, by the time of her death in 1985, at the age of 89, there were 200 members of the community living in 22 mission field houses on 3 continents. So her apostolate spread it. Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment.
We all share the same sun, and we share the same moon, and we share the air that we breathe.
But we all share much more. Every soul at its core knows what every other person hopes and needs.
Every heart wants to grow, every mind needs to know, every voice wants the chance to be heard. Every person who lives shares the hope they can give. Let us all share the joy, share the joy.
Còn chia sẻ hơn thế nữa, mọi trái tim ở trên thế gian cần biết đến mong mỏi như yêu của những người dân.
Every person who lives shares the hope they can give. Let us all share the joy, share the joy. Every heart wants to grow, every mind needs to know, every voice wants a chance to be heard. Every person who lives shares the hope they can give. Let us all share the joy.
By the time we can walk, each of us yearns for the joy that comes from being able to do for ourselves. Around the block or around the world, share the joy. Church World Service.
My name is Sister Mary Claudina, and I run a home for abandoned children. I want to take care of children who have no parents, because luckily I come from a very loving family. There are 8 of us. We learn to care for each other, to love each other, to fight among each other, just to be a family. And I think that's what I learned from home, and I wanted to to share that with children who do not have that opportunity.
33 million Americans have descended into poverty. And as their futures fall, so does our nation's.
Welcome back to our show. We're going to talk now about Father Emil Kapaun. You know, we mentioned in our first segment and second segment that their lives could be stories for novels. This one is very reminiscent of some of the war stories and war novels that we hear about and read about, and that maybe even some of our fathers participated in. So let's talk about Father Emil, and he was an army chaplain. He died very young, but let's try to fill in the gaps.
Well, as we said, he was age 35 when he died in 1951. He dies in a POW camp in China, but during the Korean War. Now, for many people watching, you know, perhaps their exposure to a Catholic military chaplain during, you know, the Korean War might be Father Mulcahy in MASH. You know, and even there were moments of wonderful ministry, but that's a sitcom. Mm-hmm. You know, this life would have been very challenging and very difficult. And, you know, we have wonderful men of all faith traditions, but especially a great tradition of Catholic priests who have served as military chaplains, who put themselves in life's, in jeopardy. They go through the same rigors of belonging to the military. Why I point all of that out is it's not just a visiting priest to a campsite. This is somebody who's part of the military. He's part of these soldiers' lives. He's part of their company. He knows their struggles. He knows their challenges. But he's also there to minister to them and to lift them up.
You know, as you were talking, it brought to mind this whole sense that as the Catholic Church tries to minister to people, there are groups that are sometimes forgotten, and sometimes we forget certain people or certain situations. As the church, we try to remember everyone. We don't do it all the time, but we try to do that. And our people in the military, above all, there's a particular apostolate that priests and religious have for those in the armed services, whether it's here in the United States and especially abroad. And there are many stories that we have heard and many stories that people tell of those priests who have dedicated their lives to the service of God, especially to young people. And we know that World War II, the Korean War, very difficult, big turmoil times. And so this young priest who had this call as an army chaplain to serve God in this capacity had tremendous pain, tremendous suffering, and yet he continued to minister, continued to do his daily duties, and was lifted up as we call him this servant of God. But also it's interesting because when we talk about this particular servant of God, we know that he becomes a prisoner. And so he takes on a different dimension. He's no longer serving freely those Catholics or those people in the armed services, but now he is in this prison camp. And so his life changes. What actually goes on then in that particular life because of that dimension?
Well, as you said, it's worth noting, he does get captured, and even the story of his capture, when he's captured, he's giving last rites to a soldier who has been shot. Mm-hmm. He's captured, but then, as we mentioned, even in captivity, that ministry continues. He finds himself ministering to his fellow prisoners. Mm-hmm. But you have to imagine what that must be like for him to himself know that he does not have freedom, that he is captive. He is going through the same turmoil, the same struggles, the same difficulties, the same nightmares and terrors of his own safety and well-being, but having to put a lot of that aside and to be a beacon of strength and support and encouragement for his fellow prisoners. So there really is that great challenge in his ministry that he would have never experienced, even in combat and even in the conflict. This takes on a whole new dimension where he has to really, it would be difficult for him to be able to really minister to the people if they saw him having all of the same doubts and anxieties they were. There's one thing where you witness by letting people know you're part of their struggle, but they also would have wanted him to be above that. And he had to balance that.
Exactly. And as you were talking, it brought to mind someone like St. Maximilian Kolbe, who was thrust in the same situation. But there's that sense that he tries to rise above what is going on in this prisoner camp, still by ministering to them and helping. We know that these people who die in the prison camp have to be buried, and so he volunteers to bury them. He takes care of ministering to them, and eventually we discover that he himself joins that unfortunate lot. And so when we talk about his ministry, what does that ministry entail? You know, for us as priests, we celebrate Mass in some beautiful places on the weekend. We have an opportunity to have shelter and food and clothing, but those are not the luxuries that people in war experience. And so we see him ministering during these difficult times.
Well, and I would think there would be an even greater challenge in his ministry. As you said, not to make light of it and not to have us feel bad about our circumstance, or guilty as it would be. You know, when you're celebrating the Eucharist in a beautiful church, it's maybe easier to see God's grace abounding or God's love and mercy for us. But to celebrate that same Eucharist or whatever form of Eucharist they could celebrate, I'm sure that the Chinese were not complying with wine and bread and those things. But to help them see the presence of God and to see his blessings in the most stark of conditions, with the unsanitary conditions and with death all around them, and each one wondering if they were going to be the next one. But to still be able to bring people to that hope of the journey to the kingdom. What an incredible challenge, but gift to his ministry.
In closing, I'd like to read something that one of the lieutenants said. He said that the Chinese were afraid of him. They recognized in him a strength that they could not break, a spirit they could not quell. And that's certainly what elevates him as a servant of God, and certainly is an example to all those who are serving our armed forces, military throughout the world, those chaplains in all of the services. We pray for them, we thank them for the ministry, and we lift them up as we celebrate Father Emil Kapaun's life. Thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
Saints of the Americas was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program hosts were Father Jim Korda and Father Jack Lavelle.